What the rise of Generation RE means for the future, featuring IES Abroad Durham alum Jack Uldrich. We are thrilled you could join us for what we know will be an exceptional event to start off your new year. As you will soon learn, no one can predict the future, but Jack Uldrich can help you prepare for it. Jack is a leading futurist, author, and speaker who helps organizations gain the critical foresight they need to create a successful future. His work is based on the transformational principles of unlearning, or freeing yourself from obsolete knowledge and assumptions as a strategy to survive and thrive in an era of unparalleled change. Jack argues that creativity and actions are more powerful and versatile than knowledge. He's here today to share his energy, anecdotes, and thoughtful business and personal advice to educate, entertain, and inspire you. Please welcome Jack Uldrich.
Jody, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. As you said, I am an IES alum from Durham, 1985 to 86. But what you might not know is I spent my entire senior year abroad, and but for scholarship, I wouldn't have been able to participate. And I can make a direct link to the work I'm doing today to that experience abroad. Before I begin my presentation, if I could just ask everyone who is on to click their mute button so that we're not hearing other people while they're at home. So what you're going to hear is a combination of my latest book, Business as Unusual, as well as some advanced thoughts on a book I'm writing right now called The Rise of Generation RE, or RE. So to start, business as unusual, what I do in this book, I outline 10 principles and they all begin with the prefix un, and they're designed to help you think about the rapidly changing world. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to outline these 10 words. The first one is we have to learn how to expect the unexpected. As a futurist, I'm now going to show you a quote, and I think this is close to a factual statement, and it's something that we all have to internalize. Today is the slowest rate of change you and I are ever going to see again. And in the era of the pandemic, it might have felt like that the world has slowed down, but I'm here to tell you it hasn't. If anything, the future has accelerated. And if there's one slide that epitomizes this, it's this. We all know that we're living in a work of virtual presentations like this, working remotely, online education, telemedicine. But this one slide encapsulates how fast the future was accelerated in the last 10 years. E-commerce was already a trend before the pandemic, but in the first full 2 months of the pandemic, in April and May, e-commerce grew as much in those 2 months as it did in the last 10 years. That is absolutely remarkable. And e-commerce, as a result, has transformed the physical retail environment. So much so that Amazon is now purchasing malls and old retail establishments, and they're using them for warehouses. But another trend that the pandemic has accelerated that hasn't really appreciated is advances in robotic technology. This past August, the FAA just gave Amazon and a host of other companies approval to begin making drone deliveries. 80% of all items that you are purchasing are under 5 pounds, and they can in fact be delivered by drones, and they might be. Our world is going to change a lot in the next few years, and we need to start expecting the unexpected. And if you don't think this isn't coming to a doorstep near you, even if you live in a rural area, it is, because Walmart, UPS, handful of other companies are already working on this trend. But another great way to expect the unexpected, and this is really one of the wonderful things about studying abroad, is I actually had an opportunity to immerse myself in history. But in order to understand the future, it really helps to study the past. And I love this picture from New York City's Fifth Avenue in the year 1903. If you look closely, every vehicle on that road is a horse-drawn carriage, except for that one little vehicle in the red box. That's one of the world's first internal combustion automobiles. Now, this is the exact same street just 10 years later in 1913. The transition was complete. Do not tell me that the world can't change a lot in 10 years, because we've lived through it in the past. and we are going to continue to live through it in the future, and we all need to begin expecting the unexpected. And let me just show you how the world of transportation is going to change. This company just went public a month ago. It's called Luminar. For $500, they're going to retrofit your existing automobile and convert it into a self-driving car. But as cars can suddenly drive themselves, suddenly ownership is going to be transformed. Not everyone is going to need to own a car. And as that happens, our physical infrastructure is going to change. Those of you who are from Chicago are very familiar with this famous building. The fact that we dedicate this much valuable real estate to cars is not something that we're going to be doing in the future. And we need to begin understanding how fast the world is changing. The second principle, we have to begin exploring the unknown. And one of the best ways to explore the unknown, or the thing that we're all going to need to unlearn, is we're no longer living in linear times, we're living in exponential times. And a number of the trends that I'm going to be telling you about are going to double 10 times in the next decade. But if something doubles 10 times, that doesn't mean it's 10 times as big. Through the power of exponential growth, we go from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16, 32 to 64, 128, 256, 512, 1,024. We're going to see thousand-fold increase in the next decade, and we need to begin exploring what this unknown future might look like. Let me just give you one area where we might want to begin exploring. Satellite technology is absolutely booming. SpaceX, other companies, going to launch 30,000 satellites into space in the next few years. To help you understand how transformative this is going to be, the first thing that those satellites are going to do is they're going to deliver high-speed internet access everywhere on the globe. To understand how transformative this is, 4 billion people have access to the internet today. The other 4 billion people on the planet are going to get hooked up online in the next few years, and this is going to transform our global economy in some powerful ways. So this is just a metaphor for exploring the unknown. This is the way many of us have always seen the world map. But the only reason we view it this way is because the world's first cartographers were from Europe, and thus they put Europe, and by extension North America, on top. Now this is an equally legitimate way to view the world. From outer space, there's no east or west or north or south. This is a completely legitimate way to view the world. But the reason we should all begin viewing the world from this perspective is the 4 billion people who are going to come online are on the top half of this map. From Africa, from India, from parts of China, from South America, Indonesia. Our world is going to change. And one of the best ways we can begin exploring the unknown, this was from last year. This is Jack Dorsey. He didn't actually do it because of the pandemic, but he was committed to spending 6 months living in Africa because he said that's where the future is going to take place. I don't know what his plans are for 2021 or 2022, but I think if we all want to begin exploring the unknown, we have to begin exploring areas that many of us haven't gone to before. And again, I just want to tie this back to the mission of IES and studying abroad and how absolutely critical it is going to be to our future. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but it's something we all need to be preaching louder. The third principle, we're going to have to embrace uncertainty. The best way to do this is we have to get comfortable with ambiguity and paradox. And I was introduced to paradox when I was studying abroad. I went over to Amsterdam. I didn't know who M.C. Escher was, but he's a famous artist. And many of you might be familiar with this paradox. It's called the eternal waterfall. And if you know anything about physics, it doesn't work. But from this visual, it appears as though it does. We have to begin embracing not white and black thinking, but either or thinking. And this is just a metaphor for embracing uncertainty and paradox. I don't speak the Chinese language. And I've heard, and again, this might just be a metaphor, but the Chinese word for crisis is a combination of two symbols, one saying danger, the other being opportunity. If we're going to embrace the future, what we have to do is we can't be paralyzed by fear. What we have to do is we have to start seeing the immense opportunity that exists within uncertainty. And now let me just give you an example from last year and this year. The hospitality industry has been utterly decimated by the pandemic. And that might seem like a crisis to that industry, but there's also an opportunity. And some companies are now retrofitting and transforming their hospitality suites and their hotels into affordable housing. So once what was a problem is suddenly an opportunity and addressing a very important need in many aspects of communities all around our world. The fourth principle, we have to unlearn old habits. This is just a metaphor for unlearning. I don't know who this fellow is, but I came across his photo on social media a couple of years ago. He's a high school teacher. And as a joke, for the last 25 years, for his school yearbook photo, he's been wearing the exact same sweater vest. And I thought that was really funny. But as I thought about it, I'm like, no, that's a good metaphor. And here's the metaphor. How often do we hear, especially those of us with more experience, say, well, I have 25 years of experience in law or banking or farming or whatnot. Sometimes people truly do have 25 years of experience. Sometimes, however, they have 1 year of experience repeated 25 times. There are things we learned early in our career and they worked and we just kept doing them. And in yesterday's slow-moving world, that was fine. But in today's exponentially changing world, what worked yesterday might not work tomorrow, and we're all going to need to unlearn a lot of the things that we think we know. And let me just relate this to one trend that's going to require all of us to unlearn, and that is artificial intelligence. I love this quote from the former CEO of IBM, Gina Rometty. She said, look, 100% of industries, 100% of jobs, 100% of professions are going to be transformed by artificial intelligence. She is spot on. Healthcare, artificial intelligence is already doing the job of a radiologist better than the world's best experts. Artificial intelligence is helping us diagnose Alzheimer's up to 5 to 6 years earlier. And it's not just transforming healthcare, it's transforming every industry, and it's going to require all of us to unlearn a lot of the things that we think we know. And to just give you a scope of the opportunity of artificial intelligence, in North America, it's estimated to be close to a $4 trillion opportunity in the coming decade. In China, $7 trillion. But artificial intelligence is going to transform education. I think one of the most exciting things, artificial intelligence is not going to get rid of teachers. I just want to disabuse you of that notion. But what artificial intelligence is going to allow us to do is to better personalize and customize education. Each and every one of us learns in a different way. And the idea that we can simply have a professor or teacher stand up before a classroom and assume every student is going to absorb that information in the same way is an outdated way of thinking, and something that we all need to learn, especially those of us who are in the educational field. But let me give you this quote from the World Economic Forum. Last year they came out with a report and they said a kindergartner starting school today, 65% of them are going to be working in jobs and industries that don't even exist today. This quote alone should wake all of us up and tell all of us that we have to get flexible and adaptable, and we're going to have to unlearn a lot of the things that we think we know about how we educate ourselves and our children. The fifth principle, we have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. Let me give you a metaphor for this. I'm a big basketball fan. Some of you might know this individual. His name is Rick Barry. He's the NBA's all-time most accurate free throw shooter. But the way he shot free throws was underhand, granny style. Now, the NBA has 1,500 players, and the purpose of basketball is to score points, and the purpose of the game is to win the game. Now, you would think, and close to 50% of all NBA players are horrific free throw shooters, so you would think that many of them would benefit from shooting granny style. But do you know how many of the 1,500 NBA players shoot this way? One. Yeah, the purpose is to score points and win games. You would think that some people would want to do that, but they don't. And why is that? And here's the bigger point. I love this quote from John Maynard Keynes. And he said, worldly wisdom teaches us it's better to fail conventionally than to succeed unconventionally. I want you to just let that quote sink in, because it's true. Most people would rather fail doing what they've always done, doing what looks and feels safe rather than doing something a little bit risky, a little bit uncomfortable. If you want to embrace the future, all of us are going to have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And this is just one example. I speak a fair amount to the real estate and the construction industry. The advances in 3D printing are moving really, really quick. And I think a number of companies should begin experimenting with 3D printers because they've already 3D printed houses down in Austin, Texas. The world's first community of 3D printed houses is now operational in the south of Mexico. The opportunity to begin addressing affordable housing and to provide safe, secure housing for many of the inhabitants on this planet is really excited. But a lot of companies, construction companies, aren't going to want to embrace 3D printing because it feels a little bit different. They're going to have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. But regardless of what industry you're in, we're all going to have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. The sixth principle, we're going to have to embrace unorthodox ideas. And it's at this point in the presentation that I'm going to begin shifting a little into the rise of Generation Re. But one of the really big trends, and it might sound like a little bit of an unorthodox idea, but is the rise of stakeholder capitalism. Stakeholder capitalism is decidedly different than shareholder capitalism. Shareholder capitalism, which has been the dominant paradigm for the last 30 years, said corporations' sole singular purpose is to make profits for the shareholders. Stakeholder capitalism says you're a business, yeah, you still have to make profits, but you also have obligations to your employees, your customers, your community, and your planet. This is a huge trend. The Business Roundtable, CEOs of 181 of North America's largest businesses just last year signed on to this principle. The World Economic Forum came out with something called the Davos Manifesto saying virtually the same thing. But now even big financial banks, this is Lawrence Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, one of the world's largest financial investment firms, saying stakeholder capitalism is real and we're going to start holding companies and boards of directors accountable if they're not doing what is right, not just by the shareholders, but by their employees, their customers, their community, and their planet. It's a really big trend, and it's going to require business to begin doing things in some ways that might feel a little bit unorthodox. But what I just said isn't really news to a group of individuals I now call Generation Re. And Generation Re is not a generation defined by age. It is defined by ethos. These are people who are reimagining, redesigning, reinventing, rebuilding the world in some new ways. And one of the really big trends that has been growing, it's on the fringe today, but it's moving mainstream, is the rise of B corporations or public benefit corporations. One of the most prominent ones, one that you might have heard of, is Bombas. And of course they make a profit, but they also have a mission to the community. For every pair of socks that they sell, they give a pair to homeless people all around the world. They are mixing business with their ties to the community and something more important than making money. It's a really big trend, and it's one that I'm personally optimistic about. The next thing we need to do is we need to start listening to unconventional people. This is Kate Raworth, and I consider her a member of Generation Re. She is a professor of economics at Oxford University. And for the first time in 200 years, there is an economist who is fundamentally rethinking economics. And she's written a wonderful book, and I highly recommend it, called Donut Economics. And that donut is that green circle that you see in that picture. It's a little hard to understand, but what she's saying is business has an obligation to pull hundreds of millions of people who society isn't really meeting our obligations to, people who lack food, water, access to education, other things. We need to pull them out of poverty, but we have to do it within the constraints of the planet. Those outer red areas are the areas where business is blowing through our ecological limits. The challenge of our time, the challenge of the 21st century, is to figure out how to help everyone on this planet, but to do it within the constraints of the planet. And what I love about donut economics is, and she sums it up beautifully, is for the last 200 years, all economists, it has been an unquestioned assumption that economic growth is good. 2%, 3%, 4%, 5%, it's even better. But unlimited growth, if you think about it, is the ideology of a cancer cell. Nothing in nature can grow forever. And business needs to wake up to this reality. And for the first time, we have someone fundamentally rethinking the future and trying to figure out how we do this in a responsible, ethical, and moral manner. But donut economics is it's not really that complicated, but often a picture says 1,000 words. This picture is the challenge of our time. We have to figure out how to pull that young individual out of poverty, but without degrading our environment. That's the challenge. And there are ways forward. And what I'm really excited is the people who I'm identifying as Generation Re are charting a path forward. In terms of donut economics, Amsterdam recently adopted the ethos. They're saying, look, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on pulling people out of poverty in Amsterdam, but we're going to be good global citizens. In the United States, Portland and Philadelphia are looking at this, and I think a number of other cities all around the world are going to start picking up on this trend. It's really exciting, and it's one why I'm optimistic about the future. But I'm here to tell you technology is going to converge with this trend. I don't have time to get into blockchain technology, but it's a really powerful, transformative technology. A lot of people think it's just about Bitcoin and digital cryptocurrencies, and it does play a role in that. But what blockchain is going to allow us to do is do so many different things in a different way. Another trend that is growing really rapidly is renewable energy. What we might be able to do in the very near future, you might be able to put solar cells on your house, generate excess energy, and then via blockchain, you could then sell that renewable energy to your next door neighbor. You could even gift it to your local church or a nonprofit in your community. It's going to allow us to do things fundamentally different. And the members of Generation Re, I think, are going to latch on to this technology, and they're going to fundamentally transform our world in some powerful, powerful ways that are going to allow us to live within that donut that Kate Raworth talks about. But if you want to listen to unconventional voices, do this. Get a reverse mentor. If you're my age or older, 40 years or older, by all means continue to mentor younger people. But I think in today's rapidly changing world, those of us who are a little bit older have to have a lot of humility, pivot 180 degrees, and get reverse mentors, people who are younger than us. Why? Because they see the world in a fundamentally different way. I love this picture. It's from a car sharing company over in the UK. And this young woman now is saving close to 1,300 pounds. I don't know what that converts to in dollars right now, but it's a sizable chunk of money. She's foregoing car ownership and sharing car ownership. That might not be an idea that you are warm to today, but listen to some younger people and see how they're thinking about the world. As an example of this, a company over in the UK, Good Energy, recently announced one of their positions on their board of directors is going to be dedicated to a person between the age of 13 and 18. And I think that's a brilliant idea. They're not giving them complete control of the company, but they are respecting their voice enough to say, we want to hear what you have to say. And I think it's going to position them very well for the future. And I think other businesses should start doing something very similar. And if nothing else, begin implementing a reverse mentor program. The next thing we all have to do is we have to start questioning unquestionable assumptions. And the members of Generation Re have been doing this in spades. And I think the epitome of someone who is doing this and represents a component of Generation Re is Greta Thunberg. Many of you know her. She's the young Swedish activist who 2 years ago, with a single placard, went outside the Swedish parliament and started protesting on behalf of climate change. She wanted the Swedish parliament to do a little bit more. 2 days later, a second person joined her. By the end of her first week, 4 people had joined her. A year later, 4 million people were marching across the globe, including 4,000 employees from Amazon, who then forced Jeff Bezos to begin a $10 billion climate initiative. One individual is driving really big change. But another member of Generation Re, and again, I want you to understand Generation Re isn't about age. This is the CEO of Patagonia. Last year, the company changed its mission statement. And their mission statement now is, we're in the business of saving the planet. He's so committed to this. Today we know the company is a manufacturer of clothing. But they said, we're so committed to this that we think in 10, 15 years, we're actually going to be a food company, because that is the most important thing we can do to save the planet. People and members of Generation Re are questioning once unquestionable assumptions, and they're fundamentally rethinking the world in some new, powerful ways in which I'm personally optimistic about. The next principle, we have to begin thinking about unthinkable things. But in order to do this, we have to take time to think. And in my Business as Unusual talk, I actually encourage people to take a lot of time, once a week, just to think about the future. Have a closed door policy and just read one article and then think deeply about how that is transforming the world. And I have a weekly newsletter. It's called my Future Friday 5. And every Friday I send it out and it's free, and I'll put a link in the chat if you want to sign up for it. And I'll say, here are 5 articles. Don't read all 5, just choose one, but read it and then think about what it might mean for your future. When I was traveling abroad, like many of you, we went to Paris and I went to the Rodin Museum. And when I was a young student, I spent a lot of time at the Thinker. But it wasn't until 10 years ago that I went back with my family. That's a wonderful sculpture, but my favorite Rodin sculpture is now this. It's the Burghers of Calais. And when Rodin first had it commissioned, people hated it because the story is these burghers helped save the community. And typically we think of putting heroes on pedestals. And that's typically how sculptors always do it. Here in the US, it's a single individual on top of a horse. And that's our definition of a hero. But he said, no, these people are still heroes, but it was an agonizing decision. And he put them on the ground to say, they're humans. And I think that's a wonderful metaphor for just taking time to think and begin seeing the world in a different way, and perhaps with more humility. And one area where I have come to, I like to think I have more humility as I think about the future. And I want to tie this back to studying history and the importance of studying abroad. We have so much to learn from indigenous cultures. These cultures successfully lived in harmony with the planet, in many cases for thousands, tens of thousands of years. We have been in charge, and by we, I'm sort of speaking of the Western enlightened mind in charge of this planet for 500 years, and we've brought it to the brink of destruction. We have to start thinking differently, and we have a lot to learn from indigenous cultures. And the 7 generations is just a reference to Native American culture, who said every decision that they make has to work for 7 generations out into the future. Today, we are so short-sighted. We can barely look beyond the next quarter. In our political environment, we can barely look beyond the next election. If we are to survive, we have to start thinking differently, and I think we can learn a lot from different cultures. But let me give you another metaphor for thinking. What I want you to do in this little exercise is just take 15 seconds and count the number of times the letter F appears. How many times does the letter F appear? And once you have counted, just quickly double check your answer. Okay, my guess is most of you said 3. And if you said 3, congratulations, but unfortunately that's not the right answer. The right answer is 6. And I know from experience most people do count 3, and what they do is they miss the 3 F's in the word of. And it's because it's a small word, our eyes pass over it. And phonetically, it sounds more like a V, so there are a couple of brain-related reasons we pass over it. But here's the point. You thought you were seeing the world clearly, but there were things right in front of you that you just were missing. And here's why we all need to take time to think. We think we see the world clearly. We don't. There are trends right in front of us, and we have to start paying attention to them. And one that I'm personally excited about is the rights of nature. In New Zealand, in 2017, they said a river is a legal person in their legal system. Now, that might seem like a fringy, wacky idea, but let me ask you this. In the U.S. legal system, corporations are recognized as legal people. But our rivers, the Mississippi River, the Missouri, the Ohio, the Missouri, the Colorado, aren't recognized. I think future generations are going to look back at our generation and say, you were insane. You gave corporations legal rights, but not nature. Now, I can't prove that that's going to happen, but this is a trend, and it's not just happening abroad. This past November, in the north of Florida, in a fairly conservative area, 90% of all voters granted legal rights to 2 rivers in Colorado. As you think about the future, understand it happens on the fringe first, and then these fringe-like ideas move to the mainstream. Down in Costa Rica, they're granting citizenship to bees and birds. And you might think, that's insane. But they're saying, those bees and birds, they're pollinators. 35% of our food comes from those pollinators. If those pollinators don't survive, we don't survive. Again, I don't necessarily think that this is going to rapidly move mainstream, but it has the potential to, and we need to begin thinking about unthinkable things. But let me just tell you why I'm optimistic about the rights of nature. It comes from this Gandhi quote. He said, "First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win." This has been the history of all social movements throughout time. Democracy was first ignored. Abolition or slavery was first ignored, then laughed at and mocked, and then fought. Women's rights, gay rights, the same issue. And I think the exact same thing is going to happen with the rights of nature. It's being ignored and laughed at today, but I think it's going to rapidly move into the mainstream and transform our world sooner than a lot of people expect. The last thing we all need to do is we need to begin opening our minds and imagining unimaginable things. I now say this to every business client, and I want you to take this to heart. I want you to exercise from your vocabulary the phrase, "I can't imagine." Too many people just use that as a pass-away phrase. Here's my point. Just because you can't imagine something does not mean that someone on this planet of 8 billion people can't imagine it. In fact, they can imagine it. We all need to work on our imaginatory muscles, and we need to begin reimagining the future in some powerful ways. And one of the best ways to do this is begin engaging in what's known as cathedral thinking. This is the Basilica Sagrada in Barcelona. It was started in 1886. It's not going to be completed until 2026. What I love about cathedrals is people began building those knowing they would never see the completion of that. But they could imagine a beautiful future for future generations. But it started today. And we have people doing the same thing. Although the cathedrals of the future, I think, are going to look different. This is E.O. Wilson, famous biologist at Harvard. And he, a few years ago, came out with a book called The Half-Earth Project. He said, if we're to survive as a species, we have to figure out how to dedicate one half of the planet to humanity and the other half of the planet for biodiversity. And you might think that is an unimaginable, unachievable goal. But just this week, 50 countries said they're committed to saving at least 30% of the planet. It's not 50% yet, but it is a start. They are imagining a different future, a future in which we can live in harmony with all the other species and plants and animals and fish out there. But if you want to open your mind and work on your own imaginative skills, do this one thing. If you have access to the night sky, get out under the night stars. It's been scientifically proven what happens is once you're under the stars, you focus less on yourself and you understand you're just a small part of a much bigger world. But then you also begin appreciating how little you actually know. And I just want to tie this back to the beauty of what IES does. Isn't that the exact same thing about international travel? We're suddenly exposing ourselves to ideas and cultures beyond ourselves. And we know, those of us who have traveled, the more we travel, the more we understand how much there still is to see and that we will never will see. But it keeps us curious, humble, and imaginative. So what is next? Well, I wanted to sort of tie back my two books together. The last unphrase I end my talks on that book on is this one from George Bernard Shaw. He said, "The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable man or woman makes the world adapt to him or her. Therefore, all progress is dependent upon the unreasonable person." As you think about the future, I just want to give you permission to be a little bit unreasonable. Think bigger thoughts. Go out to the fringe. Do some unorthodox, unconventional ideas. But then the ethos of Generation Re is best summed up by this famous Greek proverb. It says, "A society thrives when old men and women plant trees under whose shade they'll never sit." We need to engage in cathedral thinking. We need to begin thinking about a future not for ourselves, but for future generations. And luckily, there is a Generation Re, that is doing it. And I invite all of you to be part of it. And I know that you will. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so optimistic about the future. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A session with Dawn.
Thank you so much, Jack. Wow, that was great. A little brief round of applause. I'm sure there'll be another one at the end, but that was really a good way to sort of reset 2021 as we're only 2 weeks into this year so far. So if anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat now and I will curate them and I will post them to Jack. And in the meantime, I will sort of get this started. Since we're sort of all living in these uncertain times and it's not easy for us, are there any tips for us on how we can sort of embrace this new reality that we're all living in?
Yeah, I think the first thing we have to do is, I like to say, the biggest change out there is the rate of change itself. And so I think we just all have to, first, I guess if I have any advice for you, it's this, is I know it might have felt, especially in the first part of the presentation when I'm talking about future trends and how fast they're moving, is for all of us just to take a deep breath. And this is why taking time to think in silence and getting out under the night skies is so important, is that it begins giving us an opportunity to begin thinking about these trends, sort of thinking about which ones represent the greatest challenge to us or which ones represent the greatest opportunity. We can then begin prioritizing them. And then I would say this, I love this quote. It comes from Peter Drucker. He said, "The only way to predict the future is to create it yourself." And here's the paradox. When is the future created? The future can only be created in the present. So just take a breath and understand you don't have to do everything. Just grab an idea, take a small step, and get a lot more comfortable. I grew up as a strategic planner. It's what I did after I graduated from Durham. I went into the military and then I worked for the Pentagon. And I believe in strategic planning, but since that time, I like to think I have a little more humility. And strategic planning can lull us into a false sense of security. We think the future is more plannable than it is. And so the question then becomes, well, if that's not that helpful, what has to replace it? Strategic experimentation. None of us fully know what is going to work in the future. So let's just acknowledge that and embrace experimentation. But that requires that we unlearn the concept of failure. Failure isn't a bad thing. It's a powerful way of learning. So I'm not encouraging you all to bet the farm on risks, but take some small risks, a pilot project, learn a new skill, try a different idea. And those that show a little promise, give a little more time and resource and effort to.
I think that is digestible advice. Faye was wondering if you could give us a little teaser on how your new book is different from the last one that you wrote.
So the new book, Business as Unusual, first, it's very, very short. It is a book entitled Business as Unusual, has to be unusual. And so most business books, the old paradigm was you should be able to read it on a cross-continental flight in 4 to 5 hours. And I thought to myself, that's nonsense. I live in Minneapolis. I frequently travel to Chicago. I'm like, I want the busy business person to be able to finish this book in 45 minutes. So it's very short. It is very succinct. But what I did in my last book, that was called Foresight 2020, is I just used scenarios to help people think about the future. And I wrote that book 10 years ago. And just so you know, one of the scenarios I had it happening in 2016, but it was never the point to try and predict the future. But I said, if a pandemic breaks out, here's how the world might change, and it would behoove all of us to begin thinking about this low probability but high impact event. But business as unusual is a lot more tangible, just sort of skills, techniques that will help people and organizations become more flexible and adaptable. That's the big difference.
Catherine, she loves your idea of getting even a younger mentor. And she's wondering any thoughts about how going about to do that.
Two ways. Well, those of us who are fortunate to have children or grandchildren have built-in reverse mentors. But I would think that the best way to do it is, you could call it reverse mentoring, but I think that even it fits under the broader paradigm of leadership development. I mean, you're actually listening to these young people and you are respecting their knowledge, their experience, their different viewpoint of the world. And so it's almost a leadership development training program because you're giving them a seat at the table. And so I think if you are a member of an organization, I would start by going to your chief human resource officer and saying, look, I think we have an opportunity, one, to help ourselves expose ourselves to different viewpoints, understand how the world might be changing a little better than we ourselves do. But at the same time, we're helping these young people hone and develop leadership skills that they will need to navigate into the future.
And Debbie would like to know if you have any ideas on how to convince C-suite executives that there's more success than just accumulating personal wealth.
This is a really good question. And at the end of the day, I would say what we all need to do is, let me just give you a technique, and I'm not sure it's going to work, but I sometimes in this new virtual environment, I'm going to ask all of you to put your hand over your heart. Would you do that for me? And then just press down on it a couple of times. What I like about this is what I hope to do is not just make an impression upon your mind with this presentation, but make an impression upon your heart. And to answer Debbie's question, I mean, I think what we all need to do is, and if you haven't read it, David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, he has a wonderful book called The Road to Character, and his latest book is Second Mountain. But he talks about the difference between resume virtues and eulogy virtues. And resume virtues are all about success, business success, achievement in the material world. Eulogy virtues are those things that will be said at your eulogy. And I think if we can all just take a little bit of time to say what really matters to us. And I don't know how you have this conversation with a CEO, but if you are in a position to do it, is to ask him or her what truly matters. And is it just money? What is your obligation to your employees, your community, and your planet? And I think you're going to get some different answers, but somehow we have to figure out how to get back in touch with our heart. I mean, I think one of the biggest problems of the last 500 years, we have said the only things that matter are those things that we can measure. But the things that most matter to us, love, empathy, compassion, community, family, you can't measure those, but those are in fact the most important things. But to tie this back to the CEO, I guess I would say, I think what is happening is younger consumers are saying they are going to start supporting companies that align with their values. It's why Bombas, it's why Patagonia, it's why B corporations are taking over, because it's not just about money. It is about something more. And so to that CEO, if they want truly long-term success, they have to treat their employees, their customers, their community, and their planet in a prudent way. And if they don't do that, they might have material success in the short term, but they're not going to achieve long-term success. So maybe try to frame it as a long-term issue. If you're not successful reaching them through the heart, try and reach them through the mind by saying, is it short-term success that we want or long-term? If it's long-term, then we have to align with different values.
We are nearing the end of the hour. I'm going to take one more question, but just to let everyone know, Jack will answer some of these other questions later, and they'll be on the recording. So if we didn't get to you today, it'll be available early next week for you. Kyle had a question about, you mentioned movements beginning on the fringe before they go mainstream, and we're currently seeing fringe movements on the political spectrum. So how do you see the current political situation in the U.S. changing based on that current situation?
That's a really good question, Kyle. And first I would say, and I spend a lot of time on this when I talk about thinking about unthinkable things, is that the polarization and what is happening on the fringe and how social media has exacerbated that is a frightening trend, and the trend towards authoritarianism, not just in the United States, but in Brazil and Hungary and a handful of other countries is something that we have to take seriously. I think what we need to do is to recognize that wherever there's a trend, there is a counter trend. And I think what we're seeing right now is the world split between fear and optimism, and the people who are afraid of the future are, and I'm simplifying things, they're looking for simple answers in a complex world. And what we need are more leaders to say, the reason you're afraid is the world really is shifting under your feet, but it's not because of people in different countries coming across the border, or it is not one political class trying to keep you underfoot. It is a complex issue, but then to begin working towards positive, constructive, imaginative answers. So there's a lot more to say on this, Kyle, but I think I would encourage you to look at that book, Donut Economics. I think you'll begin seeing how there's a group of people imagining a much more positive vision of the future.
And then I'm going to sneak in one last question because it sort of ties into what you just said. But could you probably share what success looks like in that donut economic model?
Yeah, I think that, well, I guess I would say this is, do you know what some of the world's most successful, longest lasting businesses are? And besides sort of religious institutions and universities, they're breweries. And I think, I think this is a wonderful metaphor. I think a lot of people, when they hear the first part of my presentation and advances in 3D printing and robotics and artificial intelligence, go, oh my gosh, what are we all going to do? There's going to be no opportunity for us in the future. But this is where we need to start thinking differently. I wasn't a futurist 20 years ago, but if I was, If someone would have asked me about the brewing industry, my guess is I would have said, oh, the big companies are just going to get bigger. But that's not what happened. What took off? The craft microbrewing industry. And why is that? First, they make high quality product, but they're very wedded to their community, and they employ people in their local community, and people want to support those businesses. And I think what we're going to see in the future is when you look at a lot of these trends, blockchain, renewable energy, we could have a much better future in terms of better preventative health care, clean, renewable energy, lower educational costs, lower transportation costs, affordable housing. There's a really optimistic vision of the future, but it's much more decentralized than it is today. And I think what we need are just more leaders providing optimistic visions of the future and then providing constructive paths forward into that. So with that, as Dawn said, I'm happy to answer all of the other questions in a video afterwards. But again, if I could just personally put in a plug for IES and how transformational it was in my life and what it means to me. And I'm just thank you for everything that IES has done for me, and then continuing to give me a platform to speak to your alumni and members and friends. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Jack. And then I'm going to hand it over to Jennifer to close us out this evening.
Hey, and I just want to say a very special thank you to Jack Uldrich for a positive and super thought-provoking presentation. I can just tell by all the questions and many that we didn't get to here online how enthusiastic everyone was. It certainly gives us all something to think about as we put our heads down on our pillow tonight. I know I'm thinking about who could be my reverse mentor, and it's probably one of my children. They'll be thrilled to hear that. We will be sending the recording of this program to all of you, so please feel free to share it out with others. I know there are many people who probably registered and couldn't watch it live. I want to share with you that IES is alive and well. We are thriving. We are ready to go as soon as students can travel again and get visas and study abroad safely. I see many of you here who are strong supporters of IES. We really appreciate that support, and it is going to help us get through this difficult period right now, but move on to a brighter future, hopefully later on this year. So thank you very much. We appreciate your joining us tonight and wish you all well. Thank you again, Jack.